think the third main exit that's been important has been the fiscal exit, which has centered around who will pay for the crisis, and has been the focus of what Brian and I were writing about, the form that this exit has taken. This has been the focal point of much of the political effort of the right over the last year and a half, and it's been led by the international agencies have been leading it, and followed by the G20 trying to ratify the particular norms inside states. The IMF initially began calling, in 2009, began calling for 10 years of austerity. And 6 months later, looking at the problems of states' balance sheets and the move to deficit, they began talking about 20 years of austerity. This is, of course, on top of the 30 years of austerity that we've known neoliberalism to be. So we're in this incredible long-term phase dealing with austerity, which the ruling classes expect to go on into the future. I think the call for that austerity is not only a reflection of how they want the crisis to be paid. They want the working classes, and particularly among the working classes, the poor and the marginalized, to pay. They also expect that the problems of the crisis and the general issue of stagnation is going to carry on for a long time. The movement into fiscal exit strategies raises, I think, a couple of important issues. One of this is the question that we've all been discussing and trying to figure out whether we're able to move into another phase of growth, is, of course, that it's reproducing the conditions that have been characteristic of neoliberalism, that is, the forms of weakness of effective demand, because neoliberalism has been characterized by forms of competitive austerity from the beginning. That is, attacks on working class wages as a whole, particularly in the private sector, to aid competitiveness, and then spreading into the public sector through various forms of social austerity, cuts on transfer payments, cuts on benefits for working class people, and generalized constraint over public sector wages. And so the impact of competitive austerity after the crisis, what it means for where new effective demand will come from, and how long we'll be facing problems of stagnation, is, I think, a very important calculation and assessment to the left of the conjuncture we're in. And I think, following from Sam, what Brian was said, I think an important calculation for the political struggles and the forms of political organization we will be needing to build. This is not a short-term crisis that we're addressing, but a long-term phase of stagnation that is going to require new forms of working class agency and resistance. I think a second aspect I think is important in thinking about the fiscal exits is to the extent whether what's evolving in the response to the crisis is an exceptional form of the state. Whether the state is hardening to a degree that we'll begin seeing exceptional features. Whether you'll see in some places very sharp attacks on democracy coming from the political right, given that much of the political momentum at this moment in the advanced capitalist cores is coming from the political right. In my view, clearly we can see many features of exceptional state apparatuses being formed in this period. That is, specific aspects of the state are not are exceptional in terms of normal liberal democratic states, but are becoming norm. That's one of the things I think we saw in the G20 in Toronto over this year, was, of course, the growth and forms of the coercive apparatuses of the state. Those budgets, for the most part, are protected in the fiscal exits. There's some slowdown in the rate of growth, but for the most part they're protected. And across the board we're seeing increased money going into the domestic security apparatuses. This had always occurred from 9/11, but the effect of the crisis and the forms of resistance that are expected to continue to unfold have pretty much all the advanced capitalist core states putting more money into the coercive apparatuses of the state. We also see that the way that the cuts are being dealt with in most states, you can see it in Britain and in the US in particular, but most states have a particular form of it. In Canada we have it in a particular way that power has been concentrated in the Prime Minister's office and then particularized and personalized to some extent around Harper, is that we have special apparatuses being formed to deal with the nature of the cuts, to insulate it from political opposition of other elected members and to strengthen the capacity of the state to push through very severe cuts. In Britain, this has been the Office for Budget Responsibility, which has taken on this role in driving the cuts through. In the states, given in the U.S., in the case of how dealing with the political compromises that are necessary in the U.S., it's taken the place of the National Commission for Fiscal Responsibility, which is working out the political compromises which will then try and drive it through. At the subnational level in the U.S., at the state level and the city level, you can see a lot of forms of exceptional state dealing with this in the way that the budget cuts are being driven through. So I think this is a very important feature of this period of the state, which is different than other earlier phases of neoliberalism, which show some of the exceptional features that are occurring. I think a lot of the other ways that the exits are occurring are also characteristic of the worst features, many of the worst features of neoliberalism, and they are being intensified. Some of this is in terms of the expenditure cuts and the layoffs, which are some of the biggest cuts in terms of percentages that have occurred over the entire phase of neoliberalism. The norm being argued for is 5 to 10%, although because of the general stagnation and the deepening of the deficits and the volume of debt in each state, this is expected to go on for a period. One of the other features is the way that tax loads are being continued and tax cuts being continued. It's incredible that in this period of cuts to expenditures, particularly the most vivid cases have been in Greece and Britain, where the fiscal cuts have been matched by corporate tax cuts. In Greece, this was an exceptional given the degree of the cuts that occurred. And in Britain, also, in fact, the cuts that have occurred to the banks in terms of their tax load are better than they were pre-crisis. So there's a major shifting of the way taxes are occurring inside the advanced capitalist core, and the way it's been shifted onto working class people. Another important characteristic is the layoffs that are occurring in the public sector are not only layoffs. The British case is very telling, but this has also been occurring across the advanced capitalist core, and especially actually in the Scandinavian countries have been particularly using this, and there's been an incredible amount of offshoring of public sector jobs. So many of the tasks remain, but you have a turn to a massive offshoring of the jobs as part of the layoff structure. There's been the attack on pensions and so on. When we look at the way that the cuts are occurring across the public sector, besides some of the characteristics I mentioned of the increased money going to the coercive apparatuses of the state, there are three areas that are critical. Some is the rollback in pensions, but there's a lot of variations the way the fights of pensions are going given the differences in pension structures across the world. The key area where cuts are occurring is then on public sector wages and a systematic cut in those wages. And the other thing is, in fact, the cuts to welfare payments. It's the poor, when we look at it alongside public sector workers, are paying for the crisis. It's incredible the amount of cuts that are occurring across the public sector as a whole on the cuts. Let me wrap up in dealing with the phases of resistance and some of the issues that Brian was touching upon that. When we look at the way that political resistance has occurred to the crisis, I think we're also seeing some different phases. In the first phase in 2007, 2008, there were a lot of kind of spontaneous insurgencies around strikes, housing occupations, debtor strikes, and so on. There was difficulty in having these accumulate. And so much of those kind of stalled, particularly in the US, many of those stalled. The other phase then was some of the general strikes that occurred in Europe around 2008, 2009. But those again stalled. And I think the question now is of whether we'll be entering into another wave of responses to the public sector attacks as the austerity exits kick in. Everywhere you're seeing a new momentum among public sector unions and workers around strike activity. This is likely to sustain itself over the next year. You have a lot of coalitions forming at the base in various campaigns of resistance around students, obviously the most vivid example being Britain, but also what occurred in California a year ago. And you find everywhere new forms of coalitions appearing. And I think it's going to be important that those coalitions continue to develop and we find ways to deepen and broaden the struggles over each sector and in each sector and begin to unite them across these sectors. It's clear that you're going to have a lot of fightbacks, for example, in Ontario, in and around the healthcare sector, in and around housing, in around some of the other privatization fights, and it's clear that we need to build those and have public sector unions and community groups in them. But we're also going to have to develop capacities to begin to unite those struggles across these different sectors. And that, I think, turns to what Sam was speaking about in terms of building capacities so we can not juxtapose struggles and battles in the street against parliamentary struggles, but finding ways to unite those struggles. And I think the importance of Noam's essay is not only that, but his emphasis on the need for a radical imaginary that just does that. We're also sharing the podium today with David's book launch on a global slump, which also is in a new book series from the U.S. that Sam Liu and I have a book in as well from last year. And I think what's common in the themes from this year's Socialist Register, our book, and David's new book is the thing that David puts forward in the final chapters. He poses the question of how are we going to build and move toward a great resistance. And I think that's the particular struggle that is on the agenda right now and that we face in developing our own political capacities in the City of Toronto. Thank you.
I'm sure that there's enough for you to chew on from all of that.